the latest episode of this series, we saw David Pearson absolutely dominate the 1966 season, taking the championship 5 races early over John Sears. So today, we're going to take a look at the 1967 season and see just how bad Richard Petty would spank the field. So in 1967, there were 7 full-time drivers: Bobby Allison, Richard Petty, John Sears, James Hilton, Jim Pascal, Elmo Langley, and Wendell Scott. In the opening 9 races of 1967, Richard Petty would win 2 races at the season opener at Augusta and then 5 races later at Weaverville. And Bobby Allison would win race 9 at Winston-Salem. So after the first 9 races, it would be a winless driver leading the points in James Hilton, leading with finishes of 4th, 5th, 9th, 3rd, 20th, 14th, 5th, and 5th. Over the course of the next 9 races, Richard Petty would win 4 of the next 9, and would be so dominant, having those 4 wins, 8 top 5s, and 9 top 10s in this span, and would result in Richard Petty taking a somewhat commanding 182-point lead over James Hilton. At Atlanta, Petty would win while Hilton would finish 3rd, growing the gap to 202 points. At the World 600 in Charlotte, Petty finished 4th while Hilton finished 9th, growing the gap to 224 points. At Asheville, Petty finished 3rd and Hilton finished 4th, slightly extending the gap to 229 points. At Macon, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 2nd, increasing the gap to 244 points. At Maryville, Petty won again while Hilton finished 7th, extending the gap to 283 points. At Birmingham, Petty finished 3rd and Hilton finished 4th, slightly growing the gap to 288 points. At Rockingham, Petty won again while Hilton finished 8th, growing the gap to 331 points. At Greenville, Petty won yet again while James Hilton did not participate, and the gap was now a whopping 511 points. At Montgomery, Petty finished 2nd and Hilton finished 5th, and now a little past the halfway point of the season, Richard Petty was in full control of the championship, and it would take nothing short of a miracle for anyone to catch Petty. At Daytona, James Hilton finished 8th while Petty finished 11th, closing the gap to 519 points. At Trenton, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 10th, growing the gap to 570 points. At Oxford, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 3rd, growing the gap to 585 points. At Fonda, Petty won again while Hilton finished 5th, growing the gap to 615 points. At Islip, Petty would claim his 2nd straight win while Hilton finished 2nd, growing the gap to 620 points. At Bristol, Petty would claim his 3rd consecutive win while Hilton finished 5th, growing the gap to 650 points. At Maryville, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 4th, slightly extending the gap to 660 points. At Nashville, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 2nd, growing the gap to 675 points. At Atlanta, Richard Petty finished a mediocre 17th, and this was a prime opportunity for James Hilton to make up significant ground. But James Hilton did his best Dallas Cowboys impression, sad times, and choked, finishing 25th, and now, with 13 races to go, Richard Petty could just go on cruise control and win the championship. But what no one was expecting was Richard Petty doing anything but cruising. Richard Petty would absolutely crush the field and would go on to win the next 10 races in a row, which is still a NASCAR Cup Series record to this day, and he would solidify the most dominant season in NASCAR history. And this dominant season for Richard Petty would result in him claiming his 3rd championship in this timeline. So 1967 would be nothing short of a spanking for the rest of the field at the hands of Richard Petty. And honestly, this comment is the perfect way to describe what Richard Petty did in 1967. A couple of interesting things from this season were that Richard Petty set records in almost every single category. 27 wins is a record that still stands to this day and will probably never be broken. 38 top 5s, still a record. 40 top 10s, also a record. 5,543 laps led that we know of, still a record. A 5.0 average finish, also a record. So in short, Richard Petty's 1967 season is the single most dominant season in NASCAR history. That'll do it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week for 1968.